Okay, so class 1 functional juggling training course, philosophies, intentions, and solutions. So throughout this course, our goal is pretty simple. We want to make juggling accessible. We want to explore the ways to make juggling accessible for more people. And the first step in achieving that goal is deconstructing our pre-existing ideas about it. Because it's the ideas about juggling that make it inaccessible. It's not juggling itself that is inaccessible. Cool. I'm going to give some course notes. So as I said before, like this is a process where we're experimenting, we're still learning. I think that this course, it's producing the results it needs to, but I'm still looking for ways to make it better. So you guys are participating in this with me. This training course is intended to give an overview of the theories, social and emotional learning strategies of functional juggling. The ultimate goal is to empower each participant with the capacity and awareness to facilitate and create new forms of juggling environments. Material is presented in a technical format. However, the ultimate application is intended to be intuitive, playful, and fun. Certificates will be available for all participants who complete the course. However, it's important to understand that what the certificate represents, which is just a shared base of knowledge. So we've been given these seminars, we've trained thousands of people now, and we hand out a certificate. And what that certificate represents is that you have the same amount of knowledge as everyone else who has it. It's not like an institutionalized thing. To go back over these notes here, the key thing to understand is that it is very technical. A lot of the ideas are very technical in sort of how we arrive at them, but it's not important that you grasp all the ideas throughout the course. What's important is that when it comes to time to apply the ideas, that you can apply them intuitively. I'm going to give you a lot of technical material, but it's more to point you in the right direction. So I know we have a diverse group of people here. Like I don't know your backgrounds yet, but I'm assuming just looking at the group, it's all ages, it's both genders. So it's important that everyone's able to arrive at the same place, but that it's not needed that we all take the same path to get there, is what I'm trying to say. Because we do get some people who get intimidated, and I don't want you to feel that. Equipment, generally it's good to have balls and beanbags available for all courses. So in the syllabus that we sent out, every class tells you like some objects to have, and these were just sort of suggestions. With the exception of class 5, the only thing you really need to have with you is balls and something to write with. On class 4 is when you need to have a juggle board. We don't need the juggle board until class 4. Majority of the time we will be looking to interact with non-juggling objects. So being in a space with things is good. If you are in a space that has things in it, then you have the equipment you need for this class. So don't choose to be in an empty gym with nothing around you. That would be a bad situation. As long as there's objects around you, you are ready for this class. And then juggle boards will be used in the 4th and 5th class, but they're not a requirement of the course. So what I'm finding in delivery, because we're focused more on sort of the explanation of the ideas when it comes to the juggle board, that you could get away with not having a juggle board. The experience is definitely going to be much better for you if you have the juggle board, but if for some reason you're not able to get one, the class itself is still going to be valuable. You don't need to worry about that. For today's class, the structure is always going to be pretty much the same. I like to keep that formula so it allows you to know what to expect as we're moving through the material. So today we start with an introduction of the project, telling you that sort of what my goal is here and how you guys are participating and helping me create a resource for other people as well, and I really appreciate it. And then we're going to present. So most classes will start with a review of whatever we did the week before. This week we don't have a review. And then after the review, there'll be a presentation of new materials. We'll have time for model exercises. Some classes will have assignments. And then as much as possible, we're going to have time for sharing and feedback. We're looking for opportunities for students to apply and embody the ideas personally. So again, something with the speed of the material, because we have the book, right? You're expected to read this material beforehand. Some of the technical stuff I might be moving quite quickly through. And it's because I'm finding that where the ideas really start to make sense for the students is when you start to apply them in trial and error. Because oftentimes people make it more complicated than it has to be. And then when you start to play with it, and then we look at it together and we talk about that. That's where I think a lot of the learning is taking place. So that's going to be my focus for getting us to those places as fast as we can, and moving more quickly through the material, the theory. And then you should always keep writing materials available throughout the class, because things come up that you're going to want to write down. I always see people running for their notepads. So just as a reminder, like, even if we're doing activity, keep some writing stuff nearby. So to introduce today's topics. Also for today's class, it's going to be mostly me talking. You guys can relax. Probably about an hour into it, I'm going to talk about the 5-step method. We're going to model this exercise. It's as an example of how we can improve upon teaching methods. And you can participate in that part, but it's not required. Today's mostly going to be theoretical, and then the following weeks will be more interactive. So you can get comfortable. So to start with, the idea is we want to make juggling accessible for everyone. We have to understand what juggling is. And this is sort of a complicated question to answer culturally. For us, the way that we begin this conversation is, the idea is that if we look at the existing attempts to describe juggling, or we look at our existing cultural interpretations of juggling, all of those descriptions are based around its physical action. So this is something I noticed early on, that all of the ways we were trying to understand juggling were based externally, trying to describe it physically as an action. And if you attempt to do this with any activity, you're going to alienate people, because as soon as you describe it by its action, there's going to be someone who can't do that action. So my goal became to try to find a way to describe juggling that doesn't reflect its action. And to do this, we have to make a separation between the experience and the expression of an activity. And this is where we're going to introduce our formula solution for juggling, which I don't know if you've heard before, but it's a pretty exciting thing, but I'll get to that next. We're going to look at the state of mind that juggling creates. We're going to talk about global activation and flow state, because if we're going to say that juggling, if we don't want to define juggling by its actions, then we have to define it by something else. And the only other option we have is its experience. And the experience is something that takes place inside of the mind. It's not something that's external. We process information externally, but we experience things internally. So we look at the state of mind that juggling creates, and we work backwards is how we get our formula. So by identifying that juggling triggers global activation or flow state, the same way music and dance do, and then figuring out what are the connections between the activity of juggling that cause that state of mind to occur. We are going to look a lot today at the teaching models, and seeing how it's the teaching models that cause juggling to be inaccessible, and not juggling itself that is inaccessible. Primarily, we're going to be looking at linear versus non-linear based learning strategies, and how in the classical model of teaching juggling, we tend to use a model known as linear scaffolding. When you start off with 1 ball, then you move to 2 balls, and then 3 balls. So it's in many situations, it's an effective means for education, but in teaching toss juggling, it doesn't work. And we're going to look at why that is and how we can try to fix that. And then we're going to give an alternative demonstration. So we're going to go do a walkthrough of my alternative solution for how to teach a 3-ball toss juggling cascade, which is not the start point of juggling, but we'll get into that more later. But we recognize that that's sort of the existing standard. The existing expectation is this lesson. So, and if we want to make juggling accessible for everyone, we need to make all levels accessible. So we're going to take that classical example of teaching someone to juggle a 3-ball tossing cascade, and we're going to look at how we can improve upon it now that we have a better understanding of what juggling might be. Ready? Let's go. This is for me to drink. I put these animations for water. What is juggling? If it is our goal to increase the accessibility of juggling for everyone, then we should begin by establishing what we mean to describe by the word juggling. This is because understanding clearly what the thing is that we are trying to share will better enhance and guide our ability to further develop its educational models. Deciding what it actually means to juggle, however, can be a challenging task with some considerably difficult barriers to overcome. And I touched on this a little bit in the intro, but we're basically saying that if you try to define juggling by its action, then you're going to alienate somebody else. And that if you start to enter this conversation about what juggling is, you find a lot of debate. You find a lot of disagreement and a lot of strong opinions. And it's my belief, and I hope that you will share this with me soon, that we are imposing this inaccessibility because of the way that we define it. So to give an example, I think poi is the classic example. We see the most amount of debate, the most amount of argument around this I've observed. Because everyone recognizes poi as being object manipulation, but not everyone agrees that poi is juggling. This is because it deeply depends on which cultural interpretation of the idea each person selects to determine its value. So most people agree that they're related, but not all people agree that they're the same thing. Why is this? If you were to evaluate the activity based on our list of its expressions alone, meaning its actions, and if poi was not on that list, so if I said juggling is throwing, catching, bouncing, and I didn't include swinging, then poi is not juggling to me because I just decided to define it by its action. Alternatively, if I were to look at the relationship between the actions, so not the actions themselves, but say, what are the relationships of my body and this experience? And then I was able to make a connection as well to the state of mind that both of those experiences create, then I would see them as being the same thing. So if we are able to focus juggling on its relationship between events as opposed to the events themselves, then we have a way of broadening its spectrum of meaning. So right away you can see, oh, if we do it this way, juggling and poi, no longer a debate. This debate is going to become more challenging for us as we become more abstract with our expressions of juggling. But it's important at this moment just to sort of separate that line so we don't have to worry about the action. So to conclude this idea, juggling cannot and should not be defined by the outcomes of its physical expression alone. To describe juggling in such a way is to attempt to define all of music by one instrument or all of dance by one style. This cultural error of trying to understand juggling as action, as opposed to states of relationships between actions, is what causes juggling to become so inaccessible to so many people in the first place. So it seems pretty obvious now, if we break it down this way. If you just ask the question, I think the answers. It's more about knowing what questions we should be asking, right? And I think it's a really good question to ask ourselves. Well, if juggling is defined by its action, then it means some people can't do it. And it's the same way, if we were to define music by its instrument, if we said music is piano, then there's going to be some people who can't play piano. So those people are not permitted to experience this activity. I don't think this is fair, right? That doesn't make sense. So music, we see a lot of different adaptations of music, all sorts of instruments. And music therapy is very popular. And in music therapy, they change the instruments to make them more accessible. But in juggling, we've forever had this standard, like, nope, it's the 3-ball tossing cascade. And if you can't do it, you're not in our club. If so, and I understand the tendency to want to understand juggling this way, right? Like, it makes sense. It's a very literal interpretation. Oh, I see the person do the thing, I describe the thing I see. Because if we want to describe juggling in another way, not by its action, then we have to be able to describe the things we don't see about it. And that requires more education, requires more information. So to be fair, I think it's understandable why people try to determine juggling by its action. But we need to be a little bit more creative than that if we want to make it accessible. So focusing in on this idea, the difference between expression and experience. The expression is basically, it's the action that I use to create the experience with. And whereas the experience is the relationship between those actions. And what's important to understand about these two things is that an expression is something that can change. I can change an expression. I can't change the experience of the activity. It's not subject to change. And an example of this is at the bottom here. You see 3 jugglers doing a cascade. They're all doing the cascade. So the relationship between their body movement, space and time is the same. For their brain, it's stimulating the same state of mind, but the actions that they are using to produce that state of mind are different. But if you bounce the balls, or you toss clubs, or you toss rings, you're still sequencing a cascade formula. So if we look at these activities based off the relationship between their actions as opposed to their actions themselves, then they all become the same thing. Which brings us now to our formula solution. So if we're going to say juggling is not its action, we know it can't be defined by its action, because to do so is to discriminate and alienate. So we have to find a way to describe it in another way. And this brings us to the relationships between the actions. And if you analyze the relationships between the actions of all like recognized forms of juggling or object manipulation that stimulate the state of mind we're talking about, you're going to find a pattern between all of those behaviors. And I came up with a solution for that, a way to describe it. And it is a managed anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space and time. And to make a very clear disclaimer is that this is not an attempt to define the meaning of juggling, because meaning is subjective and personal for everyone. But this is an attempt to describe the smallest possible combination of sensory and sequencing relationships or stimulations, which are associated with the state of mind that we recognize as being juggling. So essentially, like I told you, we're working backwards. We're identifying juggling first by its state of mind. We're trying to come up with a formula solution of what produces that state of mind in regards to the activity of juggling. And what we come out with is this: a managed anti-entropic sequence of orbital events harmonized by space and time. If it is your first time seeing it, it's going to appear very strange and overcomplicated. But I assure you, throughout this course, it's going to make more and more sense. And we're going to start off by breaking it down into its 4 parts, identifying what are the requirements now for an experience of juggling to take place, for this state of mind to occur. What does my body need to experience for that to happen? So the first thing is managed. It needs to be a managed experience. So it seems obvious and repetitive or self-evident, but in order for something to be experienced, it has to be experienced. And that's what we mean by managed. And also because if you take apart this definition and you pull out one element, you end up with the definition for something else, or a description of something else. So each element is important to the formula of juggling, because you can have anti-entropic sequences of orbital events which are harmonized by space and time, but they're not being experienced. And we just call that reality. The second condition is anti-entropic sequence. So this is a fancy way of saying a structured pattern of events that repeats itself. The term anti-entropic is used because it describes an element of our sensory relationship with space and time. So understanding the state of mind that is juggling, it's really important that we understand how we process time, what is time and how we relate to it. So we live in an entropic universe, meaning that things are constantly changing. Everything is always in motion. There's no such thing as an object that is not in motion in space. And it's that constant change in space, it's our reference to constant change in space from one moment to the next that allows us to produce our linear concept of time. And the way that we process time relates to how we process information as well, and how we perceive ourselves within that time. So when we engage in anti-entropic sequences, these are just repetitive patterns. We see in nature, we see in human behavior all the time. It's using time as in repetition. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. In one situation, it's constantly changing its state of being, and in the other situation, it's constantly repeating its state of being. So dance and music exemplify this structure wonderfully, right? But also we see this structure in ways, different coping strategies for people on the autism spectrum with stemming, with this repetitive behavior as well. Rocking back and forth is an anti-entropic sequence. And what it does is it reduces our sensory awareness to change in space, which helps reduce our, or it creates a distortion in our understanding or our relationship with time. The third condition is we need to be interacting with orbital events. So in order to form a sequence of events, we need events to sequence with. In the case of juggling, we describe these types of events as being orbital. Describing an event as orbital is another way of saying that it has a start point, which is the same as its end point. So obviously, to have a sequence of events, we need events to sequence with. In music or in dance, for example, those events are the movement of your body. And your body ends up being an orbital event because it resets itself. Your body part doesn't leave your body and goes somewhere else. But in juggling, we're working with objects. So the movement of those objects is important. The way that they move in space is important. And they need to be orbital, meaning that they have to return to the place that they started in relationship to us. And then the fourth condition is harmonized by space and time. So one of the more unique things we can say about juggling is that its tempo or frequency of action is not determined by a juggler, but rather by the relationship that a juggler forms with the juggling. In order to experience juggling, one must learn to process and adjust to the constantly changing flows of sensory feedback information. So this fourth condition is really what separates juggling from being a sport. It's what really makes juggling an art form, because the sensory relationship that it requires you to have with your environment
So, ich warte mal kurz. Ich würde mal behaupten, dass bei Greg gerade die Verbindung ein bisschen schwierig ist.
Jetzt ist er weg, oder? Ah.
Würde wahrscheinlich abgeschmiert sein. Dann,
I'm coming back.
Yeah, no problem. Ich nutze mal ganz kurz die Zeit, weil die Frage gerade kam. Also Anti-Entropie ist, zumindest im Deutschen, ist es wirklich ein Begriff aus der Physik, der eigentlich nichts anderes heißt als, also Entropie ist einfach eine Eigenart unseres Universums, dass ja, Sachen von einer Ordnung in eine Unordnung übergehen. Und das sozusagen, letzten Endes sagt es nur aus, dass irgendein Muster immer so bleibt. Das heißt, es wird nicht zufällig, sondern wenn ich zum Beispiel eine Kaskade mache, dann bleibt die sozusagen so. Das ist letzten Endes alles, was erstmal damit ausgesagt wird. Genau.
Are you describing for them the difference between what entropy is?
Yeah, because normally that's what I found a lot of people stumble upon because it's coming from physics, and if people don't know this so well, then it's always like, oh, I don't know what this should be, but I basically
Isn't that so complicated? Yeah. Is like linear time versus time in a circle. You know, time that goes in a circle or time that goes in a line.
We basically in German we have like a different definition. It's like that the universe is going from order to chaos, or the other way around. So this is basically just saying that a pattern stays like a pattern. So it's not getting chaotic, it's not getting random or stuff like this. So if you have a different meaning of this, so if it's the thing is, if it's linear or orbital, is for me more this orbital thing, the orbital events. But the entropic thing, I always thought about it of the type of energy, if it's a chaotic or ordered thing. But maybe this is...
I think the key thing to understand between the second point and the third point is that they mirror each other, right? So an orbital event repeats itself in time, and an anti-entropic sequence event repeats itself in time too. And both of those conditions are acting to distort our sense of relationship with linear time. So there are two sensory stimulations that are causing the same effect, which is to distort our relationship with linear time. Yeah, are we clear?
Yeah, I have to think a little bit about it. So.
Okay. We can talk about language and alternative translations later. So I think I was on the point with harmonization. The key thing here being that it requires us to have a sensory relationship. We have to process external sensory information, and we have to harmonize our interactions with that information. This is the key point. And if you put all that together, you get juggling. Or you get the state of mind that we recognize as being juggling, which in the book we refer to as global activation, but there's human beings have many ways for describing this state of mind throughout history. Some popular ways now is flow state and meditation, you know, as two alternatives. I think flow state is the one that maybe is the most transferable between industries. Because you have people who describe flow states. You can have flow states from anything. People describe flow states when they cook. You know, anytime people detach from their linear sense of time and their brain is able to behave in this way, you get global activation. And this is where I try to focus the conversation about the benefits of juggling, because if you do comparisons of the research we have for the impacts of someone who does juggling versus someone who does traditional sports, there's so much more growth in juggling that's not being explained by the motor controlled development alone. And this is because juggling is activating a different state of mind than traditional sports. So majority of the growth, majority of the impact we're seeing is being delivered purely by its state of mind, not by the, you know, it's not related to the technical challenge of the activity. It's related to the state of mind that it creates. So juggling is a sensory activity which involves the mild distortion of our relationship with space and time. This subtle change to stimulation may seem small on the surface, but underneath it has a profound effect on the way that we are able to interact with and process information. This altered state of mind can be recognized by its hyper yet fluid states of communication and is what we refer to as global activation. Under such conditions, we observe cross-regional communications taking place all over the brain at the same time. This is also something we recognize as being part of a flow state or meditation. So, the brain is sort of really big, right? It has a lot of different pathways inside of it, but it tends to use certain pathways more than others, especially when it's solving tasks that it does quite often. And this is how we're able to do like brain mapping and program bionic hands to behave the way we want them to, is because we're understanding this behavior. But the brain behaves in other ways sometimes. It has two other states of mind. One we're all aware of, which is unconsciousness, right? When we go to sleep, we become unconscious of ourselves, and our brain behaves in a different way during that. And sleep is vital. It's a vital state of mind for us. There's a lot of repair. There's a lot of reorganizing of information that takes place while we're asleep. And the brain is able to do that because it has no intention. There's no conscious thought that is directing its behavior. And I believe that this formula of juggling, this formula of dance and music that human beings have pursued throughout our history, it allows us to, its distortion of our sense of linear time is what allows us to enter this other state of mind, where the brain starts to communicate in more divergent ways, where it's not being restricted from communicating between different regions as it is when we are conscious. This is a little bit of my hippie explanation for it, but there is science there. The key thing for us to understand here is that when we juggle, we activate this state of mind, and the benefits, the overwhelming benefits about juggling are coming from its state of mind. And this is transferable as well. So, because if you have a conversation with people about why should we be into juggling, what are all the benefits? And they ask you specifically, can juggling be good for this? Can juggling be good for that? If we can simplify this entire conversation, if we just say, yo, juggling causes global activation. And then it can just be, what are the benefits of global activation? It doesn't have to be the benefits of what is juggling anymore. We don't have to defend that point. We can just say global activation. And we already accept this idea as being really valuable. In terms of its accessibility, and why I say that, you know, juggling has never been inaccessible, just to like even emphasize this point, is that the overall cognitive impacts of learning to juggle are not necessarily associated with the development of its skill level. So the cognitive impacts of learning to juggle are correlated to the amount of time a person spends engaged with the activity. If you experience juggling for 1 hour, then you receive 1 hour of its benefits, regardless of personal skill or ability. And this is what puts juggling in another accessible category of activities like meditation and yoga, where similar properties are observed. So aside from, you know, us being able to adapt the action, to transform the action of juggling to whatever we want it to be, so we can make it physically accessible for everyone, beyond that, even by reducing the challenge of the activity, we don't reduce the impact of the activity. Because what the research shows us is that the impacts are correlated to the state of mind that it produces. So as long as I can use any means of interaction to cause you to enter the state of mind, your brain will grow in proportion to where it already is. Whereas in traditional sport, we don't have this expectation. I would assume if you had a higher skill level, then I would see a bigger impact. Because in traditional sport, you're only causing stimulation in the regions of the brain that are related to that task. So visual and motor cortexes, you see growth. You don't see growth in other regions, whereas in music, dance, and juggling, you see growth in all regions. So again, this is something to think about, that it's the state of mind of juggling that is causing the benefits, and that state of mind is not restricted to its action. So now we get to the education part. So quick recap. We're throwing out these ideas that are new. And I really emphasize this point that this learning process is something we structure to happen in layers. So it's like it's a lot about aha moments, or trying to sort of just provoke questions, provoke thoughts that we didn't have before. Like, this is a new idea. What if we tried to understand juggling not by its action? And then you see that triggers a bunch of other questions, and it takes us down this path. So if we're able to entertain this idea that juggling is not its action, that it represents its relationships between actions, and that those actions are in fact universally accessible, we end up with our next question, which is, well, why is juggling not accessible? Why do I not see juggling being accessible in the world the way I see music and dance being accessible in the world? And this is where we have to look at ourselves and question our educational models. So for the first pillar of inaccessibility, it's how we choose to define the outcome of its experience. It's determining juggling by its action. It's saying juggling is throwing and catching that makes it inaccessible to everyone who can't throw and catch. The second thing is where we choose to determine the start point of its activity. So we've already determined its action to be inaccessible. And then we say, you know what, on top of that, we want the start point of this activity to be the 3-ball tossing cascade, which makes absolutely no sense because juggling begins before this experience. We experience juggling as soon as we begin to interact with objects, any amount of objects that are moving through space. We have the opportunity to experience juggling. We don't need to wait for the 3-ball tossing cascade, and we don't need to make that our start point. And the comparison is, this is like saying if you wanted to play a musical instrument, you had to start with the violin instead of being able to play with like a xylophone. You know, it just cuts off every entry level below this point, and it's unnecessary. And it's something that we impose. It doesn't have to be this way. That's not a reflection of juggling itself. That's a reflection of our ideas. And then the third one, the one we're going to really deconstruct today, is the model of learning we apply to develop its capacity. So the classical model of learning to juggle uses a process known as scaffolding. It works by taking the outcome of a goal, let's say the ability to jump 1 meter high, and divides it up into smaller goals, which then follow a linear path of progression from point A start to point B finish. So it's that idea of saying, you know, taking a small goal, like, okay, I need you to jump 1 foot. And then you say, okay, you did that. Now I want you to try to jump 1.5 feet. It's this idea. And in the classical model of learning to juggle, we go, okay, play with 1 ball. Now, obviously 2 balls is the next step, right? And then obviously 3 balls is the next step after that. So that's the logic behind it. And it is an educational model that holds up in a lot of situations, but it doesn't work in juggling. And we're going to talk about that next. We're going to talk about that right now. So when we define the start point of juggling as a 3-ball tossing cascade, we prohibit the use of effective scaffolding because there's no way to structure the experience of its activity into the process of learning how to do it. This is because scaffolding is a linear model of learning, which requires the experience of its own activity as part of the learning process. So in the example of learning to jump higher, every time you change the height of the jump, you're not changing the experience of the activity. The person is still experiencing jumping. Whether they succeed or fail at that task, they were still jumping. So they experience the activity. When we apply this learning model to the 3-ball tossing cascade, we put 1 ball, 2 ball, and then 3 balls. Each step of the way changes the experience of the activity. Tossing 1 ball back and forth does not relate. It is not the same experience as tossing 2 balls in an asynchronous bilateral pattern. And it doesn't relate to the next step of 3 balls either. So all along the way, the steps themselves don't relate to themselves. And also because juggling is an activity that we're not able to experience until we can do. So I'm either juggling the balls or I'm not. And when I'm not juggling the balls, I'm not gaining experience about them. This causes this, if you apply scaffolding to the 3-ball tossing cascade, you end up with an outcome-based model of learning, which means that the person doesn't experience the sensation of juggling until they juggle. which is a very difficult way to learn anything. So it's important to understand that if we're going to use scaffolding in teaching anything, that experience is a requirement of that learning model. If there is no opportunity to experience the activity as the person is learning, then that you're not teaching them anything. They're just overcoming obstacles. And I tried to make this comparison in the circus schools. If you work in a circus school, if you work in social circus, and when you get a new group of children, or if you're doing a workshop event, like what are the most popular activities? When you have all your stations laid out, aerials, acrobatics, juggling, what is always the most popular? It's always aerials, and it's usually balance or acrobatics. They're in the top, juggling's on the bottom. But aerials always, because the thing is, even if I'm good at trapeze or I'm bad at trapeze, as soon as I go on the trapeze, I am doing trapeze. So as long as I'm on that trapeze, I'm learning, I'm gaining information about it, and I'm doing it. With juggling, it doesn't work that way. I don't do juggling until I learn it. So it doesn't allow me to, and that really has an effect on the learning process, the emotional learning process as well. Like I don't get any positive feedback until I achieve the goal. Whereas with things like balance, if you're on the tight wire and I'm holding your hand, you are experiencing tight wire. You might not be doing it yet, but you're experiencing it. And it's your ability to experience the activity that it allows you to learn the activity. So not being able to experience something as part of its own learning process certainly makes it more difficult to learn. However, juggling is not alone in this capacity. At first, it might seem like, oh, wow, that's a really big challenge we have to overcome, not being able to experience juggling. Like the cascade, how are we going to allow people to experience that if they can't toss? But we have so many other examples of this throughout education, throughout the world. And the solutions are often really simple. We just have to be considerate enough to, think about them. So take, for example, the challenges of learning how to swim or ride a bicycle. Lots of people do this. Clearly, in these circumstances, the consequences of failure are much higher compared to the risk of learning how to juggle. However, the nature of their inaccessibility remains the same. It is not possible to experience swimming without being able to swim, nor is it possible to experience bicycling without being able to bicycle. And yet both of these activities are widely accessible to many people, whereas the experience of traditional toss juggling is not. Why is that? They have the same exact learning obstacle. If I don't know how to ride the bike, I fall over. I don't gain sensory information about that experience. If I don't know how to swim, I drown and I don't gain information. And if I don't know how to juggle, I drop and I don't gain information. Not only that barrier, but they're also the exact same sequencing task. Riding a bicycle is asynchronous lateral. You're having to harmonize this timing, and you're having to process sensory information about your environment and your body and space so that you can stay balanced, right? So you can harmonize that interaction. And with swimming, it works the same. It's bilateral. It's the same motion, same sequencing task, same learning barrier. And yet these tasks are accessible and juggling is not. Why is that? To overcome these challenges, swimming and bicycling utilize a variety of simple low-tech solutions, which can enable sensory experience of their activities as part of their own learning process. So this isn't rocket science. Like a lot of us are aware of this. We do this intuitively in our circus classrooms all the time. For bicycling, this includes things like the help of another person to prevent us from falling over, or the use of adaptive learning tools such as training wheels. And in this situation, the student is now able to gain experience about the activity without being able to do the activity. For swimming, the same strategies of receiving support from another person and the use of adaptive training tools such as flotation devices can also be applied. Collectively, these solutions work together to provide as much sensory access to their own experience as part of the learning process. So you start to see a pattern, you start to see a theme in all these other educational models, and you can think of other examples. And you can relate this concept to all of our teaching models in circus. Like I think acrobatics is a really good one. They're using a harness in acrobatics. If you want to teach someone to do a 3-high, there's a really big consequence if the person on top falls off. And we need them to be able to afford error in their learning process. So we put a harness on them and we provide this safety. That's now allowing that person to gain experience about feedback information about that experience, and then they can develop their awareness of that task. So these are not new concepts for any of us. It's just that it's a little bit more abstract when we apply it to juggling, and we haven't really considered applying it to juggling, I think, in the past, because juggling lacks the risk of physical injury. You know, with aerials, with acrobatics, it's obvious. We don't want people to get hurt. But with juggling, we don't have that physical risk. So to summarize these failures, number one, juggling is not its action. We cannot define juggling by its action and allow it to be accessible for everyone. Juggling does not begin at the 3-ball tossing cascade. This was never true. It never needed to be true. We don't need to make it true. And then linear scaffolding is only an effective means of development when the experience of its activity is included as part of its own learning process. So we can't develop sensory awareness of any activity unless we're able to experience some level of sensation during our learning process. So just to drive this point home, imagine how difficult and dangerous it would be if everyone had to try to learn to swim or ride a bicycle without the use of training tools or the cooperation of another person. Far fewer people would be able to overcome the barriers of this learning obstacle, and those who did would have only done so by risking their emotional and physical safety in the process. The point here is that it is neither a healthy nor constructive way to develop any learning capacity, let alone that of juggling. So I think it's sort of comical if you were to take the educational models of juggling and apply them to these other activities like bicycling and swimming, it points out the absurdity. It points out the absurdity of our teaching model. So now we're going to take a look at an alternative solution. You know, if we're going to say that these are the things that are wrong, we need to be able to provide something as a step, a step in another direction. And for that, we're going to use the 5-step model of juggling, which is a lesson plan that I developed quite a few years ago now, early on in my research, the same time that I was developing the tools for functional juggling. And the idea with this lesson is that we call it 5-step because it's sort of like a counter to the classical model of teaching juggling, which is a 3-step model. It's 1 ball, 2 ball, 3 balls. And in the 5-step method, we invert this process. We start with 3 objects. We then go to 2 objects, then 1 object, then 2 objects, and then 3 objects again. 5-step juggling is alternative model for how to teach toss-in. And the idea is to sort of distort that linear process, by changing the amount of objects we work with. But really the concept is to make the start point as similar to the end point as we can. And to really focus on the emotional process. So the solution for swimming and bicycling meant that we had to focus on safety. And in those situations, the safety revolves around their physical well-being. And in the case of juggling, we don't have to worry about their physical well-being, but we do need to be aware of their emotional well-being. Because the real risk, if you ever watch someone try to learn to juggle and fail, the real risk of in juggling is failure itself, is giving up. Like that's the only thing that stops people from learning. So if we can create a learning model that prioritizes that shows awareness for how people are feeling as they're learning, and emphasize that as opposed to technical outcomes, then surprisingly, we actually end up with a better result. We end up with more people learning faster. But we have to sort of we have to turn our priorities upside down. So in the classical model, you're addressing technical. You're doing a technical development model. You're teaching 1 ball, 2 ball, 3 ball. And in this model, we're going to prioritize emotion, cognitive, and then physical. And it makes it has a big impact on the effectiveness. So although we don't recognize the 3-ball tossing cascade as being the start point, we're going to use it as an example. We're going to prove how we can make this activity more accessible and then sort of like open up our minds to all these new ideas about juggling in the process. So for reference, the classical model of teaching the 3-ball tossing cascade uses linear scaffolding, which is a 3-step process, 1 ball, 2 ball, 3 ball. This does not allow for experiential learning as part of its own development. So for a student to master each step, they have to learn it before they can do it every step of the way. This creates a high level of stress and reduces an individual's motivation to withstand the emotional consequences of failure over an extended period of time. So as I said before, like the only way people learn how to juggle in this model is through their own perseverance. They're not being taught because they're not gaining access to any of the feedback information they need to learn. So anyone who learns to juggle using the 3-step model is only because they had the perseverance, that they had the the determination to. Or they also had other capacities from other things. Maybe they played musical instruments. Maybe they were already equipped to do that. So if you use that model, it's not inclusive. If the risk of learning to ride a bicycle or swim is that of its physical injury, then the risk of learning to juggle is emotional. It's certainly emotional. And I think if any of you have had this experience of teaching juggling or asking people if they want to learn how to juggle, there's a pretty common pattern of like resistance that you find from people. The first one being when you ask them if they want to juggle, they say no. They say, I can't juggle. I'm not able to do that. They do all these negative self-put downs, and then they apologize when they drop. Constantly they're dropping and they're constantly saying, oh, I'm sorry I dropped. I'm sorry for learning, sir. It provokes a lot of insecurity. Anytime we're going to learn something new, it's going to provoke that insecurity. And juggling, because of its sort of inaccessibility, its cultural inaccessibility, many people see it as being this thing that only people with talent can do. So it challenges them emotionally if you ask them to try to learn this thing. Because for me to try to learn something, for me to believe that I can do something that not many people can do, I have to believe in myself, right? And if I don't believe in myself, I'm not going to do that thing. And then if you ask me to learn how to juggle and you don't provide me with a good learning model and all I end up with is failure, I'm going to walk away from that experience believing in myself less. So not only do we have a bad way of teaching, I feel we're also being abusive to our students using this model, to all the students that fail that don't need to fail. It's unnecessary. So underestimation and lack of attention to social and emotional learning needs of a student during the learning process is what I think really contributes most to our lack of success with our learning models. So to break these ideas down, we're going to using an example. Like, let's say you have a standard class. This is quite common experience for us, right? You've got about 20 kids, ages 9 to 12. You don't have any major impairments, and you've got like 40 minutes to an hour, and you got to teach them to juggle, right? I've been in that situation countless times. So if you were to use the classical model, the 3-step model, the idea would be to start with 1 object, to move to 2 objects, and then go to 3 objects. We get that linear scaffolding, point A to point B. It's what we expect. With the 5-step model, what we're going to do is we're going to work with 3 objects, 2 objects, 1 object, 2 object, and then 3 object. With this idea being, we start with the experience of the activity and we end with the experience of the activity as much as we can. The general estimation for outcomes, expected outcomes for the traditional classical model of teaching is pretty low. Most teachers will tell you about anywhere from 20 to 40% is what you get on a first-time lesson using that model. Whereas this is a big reason why juggling isn't accessible like in mainstream education as well, because our teaching model is so ineffective. And what we find when we use the 5-step model, if we emphasize the social and emotional learning process of juggling, we get a much higher success rate from our students. And not only that, even if the students don't succeed during the first lesson, because we've emphasized the importance of them having a positive experience and developing a personal relationship with juggling, they always come back. So even if I don't succeed on the first lesson, I know they're going to come back. So the retention rate is much higher with the 5-step model than it is with the classical model. So the likelihood of return is low. If a person has a negative experience, if you give them a model of learning where until they achieve that goal, they don't get a reward, they're not going to have a good time. So they're not going to come back. You know, especially if you're working with marginalized populations that are used to, like, you know, being screwed over. Those people don't have patience for failure. So we need to really make sure that failure is not a part of our learning process, or that sensation of failure. You know, failure is learning, but we don't want to draw attention to that. And another big thing to notice about this lesson plan that I observed, you know, if you're talking about a jump from 30% to 80% success rate, you're talking about everyone in that class, right? And with the classical model, I've observed a lot that it has a gender bias. So you're having a low success rate with your students, and of the students that have success, it's predominantly males. It's predominantly the boys that are having success with this learning model. Whereas in the 5-step model, because we're emphasizing, you know, self-expression and personal development as well, it's more gender neutral. When we get to the steps, I'll explain more like why I think that is. I think the big part for creating gender neutrality in the way we teach juggling is making sure that there's constantly space for self-expression is the simplest way that I found to always have that impact, because you're going to attract the most amount of people. If I teach you to do something and then I allow you to create something yourself with that thing, then it doesn't matter what my intention is for the thing anymore, because you created a personal relationship with it. I don't have to tell you what it is. So we're going to be looking for opportunities like that throughout this lesson, ways to help people form personal relationships with the activity, ways for them to feel accomplished and successful throughout, and ways to distort the linear progression or the linear model of learning so that people are present in their learning process as well. Like, this is a really important concept. We don't want to create expectation. We don't want people to be anticipating where they are going. We want them to be in the moment where they are learning the thing that they're learning. And then, oh, these numbers that I'm throwing at you, these are not like academic numbers. This is just like, as someone who's been teaching for a long time, who's traveled the world, is just community feedback. But the true reality is that the 5-step model, it destroys. If you don't believe me, you can try it yourself, and you will find an immediate difference in how many students are learning to juggle in your classes. So now we're going to take a look at the actual steps. We're going to break them down. If you want to follow along right now, you can. But it's not necessary. It's up to you. It's your style. So before we introduce the step, I'm just going to talk about sort of some of its goals, what we're trying to achieve. The idea is concepts before components is what I call it. And it's like, we know that the juggling relates to the sequencing relationship, right? And not the action. So what I need to do first is stimulate that sequencing relationship. And it's very easy for me to do that. There's a lot of ways that we can stimulate the sequencing relationship of a cascade. We observe this sequencing relationship in so many other activities, swimming and bicycling, for example, but also braiding hair, jumping rope. It's a sequence we know. We just need to now condition this behavior for our participants using 3 objects. So the idea is condition the behavior of the cascade sequence in the absence of technical challenge. So to remove the technical challenge of throwing and catching and just provide the experience of the relationships first. A key element of this training model is we need to promote time on task and repetition, because in order to build these connections, these new connections, you need a lot of repetition. So much repetition that it can become boring. So motivation becomes a big part of our responsibility as educators now. And one of the ways that we achieve this is creating, focusing on the relationship between the activities and not the actions themselves. So we're constantly going to be adapting, presenting the same challenge, but changing its expression, right? So that the students are feeling a constant sense of progression, they're getting experience with other activities, but we're constantly reinforcing and conditioning the same sequence and relationship so that we can cause new neural connection. We are really focused on building confidence and reducing anxiety throughout the entire course. It's important that the students feel a sense of success. So one of the ways we do that is we structure attainable challenges. You know, we're not, you know, in the classical model, going from 2 balls to 3 balls, there's a whole bunch of learning in between there that we're not addressing. There's so many things a person could learn in between those 2 steps. And here we're really focused on keeping those gaps small, because the smaller we can keep those learning gaps, the easier it is for students to progress along them. And then the last thing is that constantly trying to provide space for students to be creative and personalize their relationships with the material that we give them. So here we go for the demonstration. For this, you're going to need 3 balls and 1 ring. If you have it, I can pause this. Do you want me to pause it while you guys grab that? I'll pause it while you guys get ready. So as you're getting that, I'll say, like, the steps themselves are very helpful. Yeah. If you're someone and you just remember, you learned these steps, someone showed you, oh, try teaching juggling using these steps, you will see an improvement in your students' learning. But if you understand these steps and also the teaching styles that go with them, meaning which sort of communication styles, how we're making corrections as well, you will have even more success. So to start with, I always introduce this lesson using a mirror intro. And by a mirror intro, I mean, I'm going to model a certain behavior and I want my students to copy that behavior. So I do a whole sequence of them modeling my behavior. I'll start it for you now. And I say, show me your beanbag hand. Now show me your empty hand. And I have everybody model this with me, and I'm seeing that they're doing it. I'm looking at them, they're looking at me. And this sequence, you can mix it up, you can go crazy. This is a really simple introduction game as well. It's really helpful for teaching because it draws attention to where the students are learning to listen with their eyes and not with their ears, right? I want them to be looking, processing, and copying. So by starting your lesson plans using any sort of mirror activity or any clap-in sort of game where they copy you back, we want to encourage copy behavior. This is sort of a basic way that human beings learn. And it's more universal. I don't need to use language. Now I can communicate to you with my body. So trying to start your activities with mirror instruction is a really good way to begin. And then we make an explanation. We say the empty hand picks up and the beanbag hand puts down. Empty up, beanbag down. This is a really complex sequence to explain, right? The cascade. And what we're trying to do is reduce that explanation. I'm not talking about throws or catches or angles or parabolas. I'm just saying the empty hand picks up and the beanbag hand puts down. And most people get this idea and they begin to do this. We then encourage them to speed up and go faster. Another exercise is to have them close their eyes. So after they've done it with their eyes open, I say, great, now try it with your eyes closed. And even sometimes this is very useful if you have a hyperactive child that is not able to be calm enough with this activity. Asking them to do it with their eyes closed, they do it much better. Even in some situations, students will perform this better once their eyes are closed as well. Then we do the shoulder juggling. So here you place one beanbag on either side. And for this, I'm using storytelling as well. I'm always trying to incorporate narrative. So I say, put one in, take one out, or I pretend that it's a cell phone and I say, take a call on this side, don't drop the first call. There's lots of ways, easy ways to explain these type of activities without giving technical explanation. And that's really important for their accessibility as well. I then do this armpit juggling activity. And what you notice here is it's all the same, right? It's the difference between bouncing balls, throwing clubs, or throwing rings. These are all expressions of the same sequence. The person is getting time on task and repetition. We are conditioning the sequence and behavior of the 3-ball tossing cascade. And we're doing it in a way where it's accessible. We're also adding variation to that activity. So every time the student does a different variation, that's a new trick that they feel that they just learned. That's another reason for them to tell somebody else, hey, look at me, right? The more our students are saying to themselves, hey, look at me, or saying to each other, hey, look at me, the higher their confidence is becoming. And then I use elbows, and you're not restricted to these variations. This lesson, this is a model for you. The idea is to condition the sequence and behavior and to use different expressions of that as well, so that we get more interest, more motivation, and that we get a greater sense of confidence. It also makes it more conceptual. If you teach someone to do this activity in one location, it's more like a trick that they learned. Whereas if you teach them to apply it in many different variations, then it's a concept. So now they understand it as a concept. Before I go on to correcting errors, how to correct some common errors, usually before I even finish this activity, it's very normal for students to start to come to me and say, oh, look what I figured out. Look what I figured out. And they'll show me another variation, which I did not demonstrate for them, because they figure out that, oh, if I put this ball anywhere, I can put one behind the back of my knee, I can put one in my shoulder, and I can do this same concept, and I can just rotate them. So students will start to be creative on their own. And it's important that you encourage that as well. This is what I mean when I say, like, don't just show them the thing, let them create with it. So give them the model. And a really good step, if you want more material, is to play this game with rings, because rings, they allow you to put like on your body. You can do like 2 rings here, and I can do the cascade sequence, right? I can switch it out. I put one in, I take one out. I put one in, I take one out. And I can start to pass these with other people. As long as they're sequencing the cascade, they're getting that development. And it also makes it really easy to get material for your students too, especially if you're working with young students that haven't started tossing yet. It's you can use just to create acts for them as well. Because these objects can be anything, because we're not throwing them. You do the same games, but you sequence functional objects. and now you have a story to tell as well. So allowing that space to be creative is really important, and students love it. So I encourage you to make time for that. It's really important. In terms of correct and error, the most common mistake that we see, the only mistake really that we see at this step, is when a student, at the beginning when we go slow, nobody has a problem. I make sure to go really slow at the beginning when I'm introducing this. When they begin to go on their own and they choose their own timing is when you start to see this happen. They will always pick up the ball with one hand, and then they'll always put it into their dominant hand. The less dominant hand will start to pick up, and the dominant hand will always put down. So you see this swapping between the hands. We also see this in traditional toss lessons when you try to teach them 2 balls for the first time and they pass underneath, right? They make that pass underneath. Making this correction in the air is much harder than making it when we're doing body juggling. So it's actually a really easy thing to correct at this level. It helps me identify too, very early on in the lesson, who's having trouble sequencing this task. So at some speed, people will start to make this mistake. When you see them make this mistake, the best way to correct it for them is you don't have to explain anything. You just have to prevent them from passing between their hands. And the way that I do this is I obstruct. Either I'll put my hand in between their hands just to stop that, and then, or I'll make contact with their ball to stop their arm from passing it. And when you do this at first, the student will really try to fight you. They'll try to bring their hands together, and you don't let them. And then you just wait. The key thing is wait. Sometimes you might need to make a gesture, like point to the next step for them, but we don't want to make explanation because there are only so many possible solutions here. And it's important that we allow the student the opportunity to figure that out for themselves. If you allow them to do that, you will have to correct them less often, right? So the way that we do it is we just prevent them from making the mistake and we allow them to find the solution. You have to be patient. You have to trust that people can do this. And the more you practice it, the more confident you become in this correction style. The one thing I will say about it, if you look closely here from a sensory standpoint, when I make this correction, I'm really careful to ensure that I contact the ball and not the person. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to encourage the person to start to listen to information that is coming from the object, not that is coming from me. So if you make contact with the person's body and then you remove that contact, now that association is with the body, it's not with the object. So they might lose that association and go back to making the mistake again. Whereas if I create the association, the sensation through the object, I'm encouraging them to have the conversation that I want them to have. And then when I remove that contact, there's still a sense of that stimulation, right? Because I taught them to communicate with the ball, not with me. It's a really small thing. It's not going to make or break your success, but it is helpful to know that in making these corrections as much as possible, we want to try to interact with the object, not the person. So this PowerPoint and these videos are going to be available for you after the class. I sent the link to Mark already, and we can post it in the chat again. So you don't need to worry if you don't remember these steps. Today's class is more about like having this conversation, looking at the steps and asking ourselves why and what's the impact. So creative expression, every step of the way of learning should include opportunities for self-expression and creativity with whatever material is being developed. We do not have to wait for the 3-ball tossing cascade to begin to create and express things with juggling. Once students demonstrate an understanding of any new skill or opportunity, we want to create opportunity to create and express. An opportunity to create and express should be provided. This produces a personal relationship with the activity and leads to a greater sense of self-motivation and interest from everyone involved. Some students will pursue these experiences without instruction, whereas others may need additional guidance or encouragement to get started. And I think it's really important to understand just how it changes the relationship in general. We can relate to this for ourselves. There's a difference between when someone shows me something and I do what they showed me. And then when someone gives me information and then I use the information they gave me to create something new. Even if that thing was created 1,000 times before by 1,000 other people, for me, I created it. That process, that experience of creating it, it changes my relationship with that activity. And this is where I find in terms of motivation, you get more the gender neutrality as well. And just in general, just human beings in general. All human beings like to be expressive. All human beings like to be creative. So we now, in approaching the juggling this way, we can allow them to do that. So, because with the toss juggling, you learn the cascade and then you start to learn the tricks for the cascade. So it's such this delayed gratification. You have to really want to be part of that club to get to that point where you can start to experience where I'm saying now, like, what if we don't? What if we just, the moment we started to interact with juggling, we started to create with it? What if we did it that way instead? Okay, so moving on to step 2. Step 1, the focus was to sequence this relationship, right? To build motivation and to sequence this relationship, to condition this relationship. For step 2, we're going to be looking on learning to sensory sequence time. So we need to develop an awareness of time. This first step was about developing our awareness of space, our spatial relationship with juggling. Now we need to develop our sensory relationship with juggling, which has to do with its sense of time. The reason I move at the speed that I do when I'm juggling is because I'm responding to a sense of time that is being created by an object that is in motion through space. So it's kind of a really complex sensory formula. You know, it's a complex task to gain that awareness. And people don't naturally have it. It's something that we need to develop. So, you know, when you start to ask your students to throw and catch objects, you need to be aware that they have to develop their sensory awareness of time with those objects as well. So for step 2, we want to promote bilateral sequencing capacities, continue to promote the bilateral sequencing, and to develop sensory integrated awareness of time. By that, we mean having a person, when the first person starts to throw the object into the air, there's a lot of, you know, anxiety and nervousness. They respond really quickly, oftentimes faster than they have to, because they have not yet determined a sense of awareness for how long that object is going to be in the air. Their bodies don't know yet. They're still learning to process that information, to learn, when I do this, how much time do I have? Once a person becomes more aware of that, then they can easily sequence or more easily sequence the activities of toss juggling. When a person doesn't have that awareness of time, they're trying to process as fast as they can, and they overstimulate, they overprocess, and they just collapse, right? The system shuts down, you get nothing. So the other thing is that's sort of the technical outcome of this step. And then as with all of the steps, we're constantly trying to build confidence and reduce anxiety through a constant sense of success and narrative influence, as opposed to technical instruction. And this is, we're going to see a lot in this step, but this is something that relates to any model of education. Anytime you're teaching anything to anyone, especially if it's something that you know is going to cause them to be anxious or nervous, narrative-based instruction, using storytelling and narrative as opposed to technical instruction. I have seen so many juggling coaches stand in front of other people and explain to them the geometry of juggling, throw into the corners. When the ball gets to the top, you got to throw the next one. Like, so much information that is completely unrelatable, and it just confuses people. So my proposal is, what if instead of giving a technical explanation, we just gave sort of a playful story as a way to encourage certain behavior, and then we allowed people to figure it out for themselves. Is a big part of this step here. And the idea is also, we're trying as much as possible to create a state of play. We want learning to be fun. We want it to be a playful experience. Because if a person is engaged in play, they're engaged in a sense of presence, and also they're not going to be dealing with all that insecurity and anxiety that we see in the traditional classical model of learning to juggle, where we have students who are constantly giving themselves negative put downs and are needing constant emotional support from their instructor just to try. Whereas in this model, we are trying to, that's one of the obstacles. So that's one of the obstacles we need to remove as well. And one of the ways we're doing that is by creating a classroom or a lesson plan that is really play. So I'm going to introduce this step now. Sensory sequencing time. So for here, as I said, we use a narrative intro. I don't tell the people, I don't give instructions. I give a concept. So here I say, show me your face inside of the ring. And then I ask all my students, now show me now it's not a ring, it's a moon. And I want you to show me your face. So everyone looks around, and everyone's face, they're getting attention. And I say, now show me your beanbag. I say, now it's a cow. This is a moon and this is a cow. And I say, can your cow jump over your moon? I ask a question. I say, can your cow jump over your moon? And I'll demonstrate it. And then I'll say, very good. And majority of people figure this out. I didn't have to tell them, pass the ring, throw the ball. When the ball gets to the highest point, pass the ring underneath and then catch the ball. That creates a lot of information and it creates a lot of expectation. If I tell you, if I ask you, can your cow jump over the moon? And then whether or not your cow does it successfully or not, it doesn't really matter, right? Because there was never an expectation. I never told you like you had to do this thing. So when you don't do the thing, you don't feel bad. This is one of the benefits of using narrative instruction. It's also causing your student to use visualization. If you give me a story, now I have to work out the mechanics of that story. So we're encouraging real learning to take place. Oops. And now the idea is, so what I'm getting the student to do is to change hands and to process the sense of time of the ball going back and forth. We want to continue to condition that behavior because we need repetition. We need a lot of repetition, but we don't want them to get bored and we want them to feel more successful. So we change the activity slightly. We say, can your cow jump through the moon? And then we continue down this path and now we say, okay, now put your cow inside the moon and now now it's a barn and the door opens and closes like this. And I say, show me that your door works. Can you show me your door works? Again, what I really want is them to sequence this task, but I'm not telling them that. I'm asking them a question. And I demonstrate for the cow to get out, it has to jump. For the cow to go in, it has to jump again. None of this story has to make sense. It just has to give enough of an idea about the activity that the person can figure it out. And then you have to practice on both sides. And then ultimately, at the end, we put it all together. But for the last step, it's quite complicated. So I tend to sequence just the ring first. I have the student sequence just the ring first. I say, only with the ring, show me hand, arm, hand, arm, hand, arm. Because I'm modeling for them how to break down the task as well. And then we just add in the jump. So the cow jumps from that barn into the other barn. Great job. Let's see what comes next. Okay, so before we go to correcting errors, what do I say about that? So if you go, the whole sequence development, it works like this. You're doing cow jumps over the moon, cow jumps through the moon, cow jumps out of this barn, cow jumps out of the other barn, and then cow jumps between the barns. So you see that the tasks are getting more complicated and they're getting more complicated in a very specific and intentional way. What my goal with this task is to understand, to ensure that my students are able to sequence 2 alternating bilateral motor control movements within the timing of one toss, right? It's the same idea in that classical model when you throw one ball and you have your students clap their hands or do different things like this. But the difference is now I'm using a physical object. So it's causing my brain to process, an object as opposed to just an interaction in space that doesn't have feedback information the way an object does. So by the end of this, when we get to the last step, we now know that. I know that every student who's reached this level has all of the sequencing capacity they need in relationship and a sensory awareness of time. They also have the confidence and the motivation. So I've prepared them for everything that needs to come next. For correcting errors on this step, it's really, I did it again. I got to learn to navigate my own PowerPoint. Practice both sides. Good job. Correcting errors. So anytime a person has trouble with this, it's not going to be motor control related. It's going to be sequencing. They're learning to process their relationship with time. They're learning to gain a sensory awareness of that object moving through space. So if they're having trouble doing this, the only thing you need to do is give them more time. And the easiest way to do that is shadow juggling. So you just catch the ball for them. You don't give them the instruction. Maybe use your hands, gesture, give them as much time as they need, allow them space to process. And when they make the correction, boom, they keep making the correction. You don't have to keep reinforcing the idea. And that's the end of that video, right? Yeah. So to conclude this step, like we're using, there's a lot of strategy that goes into this. There's the steps themselves, which I think is the easier part. And again, you don't have to use these exact steps. If you want to make up another story, if you want to use other objects, it doesn't have to be a ring and a ball. The key thing is it should be one object should be a ball, and the other object should be something that people are less likely to throw. Because the idea with these patterns is it's a really common juggling pattern. It's called 3-1-2, and it looks like this. One ball goes over the top and one ball goes underneath, right? They don't change positions. The ball that's being thrown is always being thrown. The ball that's being passed is always being passed. If you give someone 2 balls, a beginner juggler, 2 balls, and they don't know how to juggle, and you ask them to do that pattern, they are only going to juggle in a circle in one direction. So the idea is that's a natural tendency for people. So we allow them to do that. We're like, hey, you know what? Everybody wants to do this. Let's let them do that. But let's give them something. Let's put in the other hand, one of the objects, something they're not going to throw. So it can be a cell phone and you can pass it back and forth. I'm developing the same sequence in relationships. And then with this, I can figure out other movements that I can do as well. So it doesn't have to be a ring and it doesn't have to be the story that I gave you, but it should be something that you're not able to throw or that people are not willing to throw as much. And it should have a story. You shouldn't be explaining. If you can try it for yourselves, you'll find out. It's like, it's sort of like mind opening at the beginning, because I spent a long time trying to explain juggling to people in really complicated ways. I thought I was helping them. And then when I started just telling them stories instead, people started learning better. So it's something for you guys to try out for yourselves and to begin to explore. And I think a lot of it has to do with not creating expectation, right? As soon as I say, hey, try to throw the balls this way, you know I have an expectation, right? So now that makes the person self-conscious, it makes them aware. And again, we say when people are learning new things, especially things that they consider to be inaccessible to them, we know the person is going to be experiencing a lot of insecurity. And this approach to teaching really helps get rid of that anxiety, get rid of all those issues. And then again, at the end of this activity, we allow opportunity to be creative and self-expressive. This happens organically anyway. You know, most common first thing I see is a child will tell me, oh, look what I can do, look what I figured out. And they'll throw the ball between the ring. They'll keep catching it in the same hand, but they'll throw it back and forth. And then someone will figure out that they can pass the ring under their leg and throw the ball. And then we continue to encourage that. And it's great. It transforms the energy of the classroom. You know, if you imagine now, I think we're going to talk about this. Yep. So we're only at step 2, right? This is the first 2 steps of my model, of my proposal. And I want to do a comparison to where you would be in the classical model at this point. To give us a sense of why it's more successful too, because the following steps, it's not 5 new steps, it's 2 new steps. We have the classical model is built into this lesson plan. We are just proposing to add these 2 steps before the classical model, and then that enhances the learning outcomes of that traditional model afterwards. But if you're going to do a comparison just of where a student is at the end of step 2 in the classical model versus where they are at the end of step 5, it's going to become really clear why one student has more confidence than the other, and why one is going to be more motivated and more prepared to overcome the challenge of learning a 3-ball toss-in cascade. So at the end of step 1, in the classical model, a student is able to throw and catch 1 ball back and forth. Maybe they can clap their hands or do something with their body. At the end of step 1 in the 5-step model, the student is able to express juggling in many different ways. They're able to show you that they can do multiple different expressions of the same idea. And they're able to create new material on their own. At the end of step 2, the students are able to throw and catch 2 balls back and forth in the classical model. And in step 5, or in the 5-step model, you have multiple variations of the 3-1-2 site swap pattern with a ring and a ball. And again, the students are also able to create on their own. So in terms of outcomes from a student's perspective, by the end of step 2, even if I recognize each of these steps as being its own accomplishment point, I only have 2. So it's not the accomplishment point. The accomplishment point that I know from my perspective as a student in this class is I need to get to 3 balls. That's when I'm juggling. So I don't feel I started juggling yet. Even at the end of these 2 steps, I don't feel I haven't juggled yet, and I can only show that I can do 2 things. Whereas at the end of the 5-step, at this point in the lesson, the students have more than 10 new tricks that they can tell you they can do, plus the ones that they created themselves. Who's feeling more confident? who's feeling more capable. So the emotional stress level in the traditional lesson, the classical model, is really high. I observe so much insecurity, so much negative put downs. I see students looking at other students and like they don't want to be seen, right? No one is really trying to get attention during this lesson plan because everyone is experiencing failure. And the social engagement level is very low. Whereas when I make a comparison to this approach to do a narrative play, to make the experience itself the first step, and then deconstructing that to work back up, I see a very low level of emotional stress. I see a lot of happiness and joy and laughter and social engagement. You know, if I've tried this, I've done this, I've used that second step with the ring and the ball, and I've explained it technically, and then I've used storytelling to explain it. And when I use storytelling to explain it, people are not afraid to make mistakes in front of each other. Whereas when I use technical explanation to explain it, people are much more self-conscious, which means they try less, which means they learn less. So the 5-step model provides more accomplishment, more creativity, more play, and more fun. Students' emotional levels and confidence going into the 3rd step of the 5-step model versus classical scaffolding highlights the reasoning for its success. And another example I give for this is that when I present, you don't have to do this, but when I present, usually when I give that last challenge for the ball to go from one side to the other, the last challenge of it going between the barns from one hand to the other, it looks really challenging, and it is. But one of the ways that I would use to test out, like to make sure my students are emotionally ready for the next step, because the next step they're going to be more on their own. They re-enter that linear path of learning, and this is where they need to have the most emotional resilience to failure. So traditionally in a class, I have to constantly motivate my students. When they tell me they're not able to do something, I have to remind them, yes, you can. Whereas at this point in the lesson, because it's just been this constant flow of success, the student, if they had any doubt about their ability when they came into the class, it's really hard for them to doubt their ability now because they've just learned so many things in such a short period of time. And one of the ways I like to challenge that is I like to doubt them. You know, I would normally never do this in the classical model because I'm struggling to get their motivation. But here I have so much motivation. So I like to play games with them and tell them, oh, I don't think you can do this next trick. And then they all tell me that, oh, maybe he's right, or I see their response to that. You know, usually they're the ones that tell me they can't do something. So when I poke fun at them at this point, saying, I don't believe you can do this, they all get so excited. And they're like, I want to try. Maybe I won't do it, but they're willing to try. They're not afraid to try. And that's the really important thing to understand in what we're accomplishing with this model as well. We are really building up their confidence as high as we can before we ask them to go into the swimming pool, right? So if we didn't have flotation devices, this would be equivalent to saying, like, I'm going to train you so you have as much awareness about swimming as you possibly can before I actually ask you to go into the water, right? It's responsible teaching. So then when we get through steps 3 through 5, they are the same. They're the same as the classical model. And if you have any of your own preferences for how to teach this lesson plan, bring them in. They are only going to be stronger now because of this. One thing I will say is that the amount of time we spend on these steps is much lower. We spend majority of the time on steps 1 and 2. And then by the time we get to the tossing and catching of the 1 ball, the 2 ball, and the 3 ball, we've already addressed a lot of the problems that the person would have. So we don't see as many mistakes, and we can move much faster through this. So for tossing of balls, I usually say eyes up, hands down, that's it. And I give about like 60 seconds. Because the students just made hundreds of throws in the last exercise, the last activity, they made this throw. They know the timing of this throw now. This step is a little bit redundant. You could even consider skipping this step. But if it's there and you want to do it, it's kind of nice to build up that way. For step 2, or for step 4 now, which is 2 balls, the instruction that I give usually is that the hands take turns. I really do my best to avoid using the word throw and catch throughout this entire lesson because I feel those words create anxiety and those words create expectation. And I tried to come up with, I tried to come up with explanations that are relatable. So your hands take turns is a relatable explanation for something. Whereas, you know, throwing the ball on a 45 or on an angle, and when it reaches the other side to throw the other ball, way too complicated. So look for, you know, try to look for simpler ways to explain these ideas. Just give the intention is all you need. So this is what we normally see. In a traditional lesson, when I get to step 2, half of the class is doing this. Because we've already developed the sequencing capacity, the sequencing relationship with the cascade, when I get to this step now, I have maybe less than a third of the class making that mistake. So I'm able to spend more time with less people because we made this correction in step 1. We don't see this problem so much. If I do see this problem, I just have to do the shadow juggling again. You hold your hands above the person's head. So I see this problem occur less, and when it does occur, it takes me less time to correct it as well. At the beginning, with the classical model, it takes me 3 to 5 minutes to make this correction for every student, and half of my class has that problem. In this model, it's a quarter of the class that has that problem, and it takes me like 1 minute with every student to make the correction because they already did this relationship. You know, they know it. It's just about making the connection with them to that new relationship. That's it. When we get to 3 balls, I really encourage, like, you're free to teach how you want. These are just suggestions now, but I really encourage a flashing. Make your students flash first because it's important to understand that there is a big difference now between throwing the 2 and throwing that 3rd ball. Making that 3rd throw is causing some complicated things to happen. And I also say that it's not possible to catch a ball if you don't throw it. So you have to get them to throw. If they don't throw that ball, they're not going to catch it. So I encourage you to have your students do flashes and then try to do collections. After they make the flashes, I really encourage doing collections. So not just telling your students, see how many throws you can get. Just try and see how many you can get. Telling your students to decide how many throws they want to get first, and then asking them to try to get that exact amount. And if you can, work up from 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not actually important if the student does what they plan on doing. The reason I emphasize you encouraging your students to decide how many throws they want first is because that will encourage them to visualize what they are about to do next. And that's a capacity we want to encourage and develop in them. So if I just start to juggle and I don't know what I'm going to do, I haven't visualized my experience. Whereas if I say, okay, I want to make 5 throws, you'll see the eyes. You can see it in the eyes. There's a moment, there's a breath before a person does it when they're going to visualize what they're going to do. And by asking your beginners to set an amount of throws they want to make, that will cause that to happen. If they make more throws than that, it's fine. We're happy. It's just to cause them to visualize. Some additional teaching strategies, because in most situations, by the time, or not in most situations, clearly, because we developed this sequencing relationship, because we developed the relationship with time, because we can see the person is able to throw and catch objects, we know they have the technical and they have the cognitive capacity to juggle. If a person is still struggling at this point in the lesson plan, usually it has to do with anxiety. Usually they're overstimulated for whatever reason, whatever personal reason, and it's not allowing them to think and process information clearly. They haven't maybe fully developed this relationship with the timing. So in those situations, it's important to understand that at this stage of the lesson plan, it's very few people that are still struggling. And of those, we need to be aware that they're going to be experiencing stress, and we want to find time and space to comfort them with that anxiety. And some of the basic ways, some of the common solutions we have for this is, number 1 is shadow juggling. And I encourage standing behind the person, but you can stand in front of the person, you can stand inside, you could have 2 teachers catching, 1 from each side of the body. But the idea is to allow the person to sequence the activity and then increase the rate of time, right? Increase the tempo over time, speeding it up so they get the sensation. It gives them the sensation of the activity. They can process that feedback information, they can learn. 2-person juggling works the same way, but it divides the responsibility. Now the person only has to focus on sequencing one side of the system. So you want to make sure that you practice this on both sides. But something with this activity, it helps the person learn sensory. It really helps develop their sensory awareness of the juggling, but it's not causing them to communicate bilaterally between sides. So it's not going to provide them with that learning style. So you should use a combination of these 2. And then the last 2 additional strategies I have is 5-ball ultimates and restricted body movements. So for the 5-ball ultimate pattern, it's a passing pattern. And it seems strange that you would make this lesson, you would do this before you learn to juggle the 3-ball cascade, because traditionally we think of this as being a trick that comes after I learned to juggle the 3-ball cascade. But if you're doing this with an instructor, someone with experience, this trick is actually really useful, and it's very helpful, and it's more accessible than the 3-ball cascade. So the idea is that every toss is a pass, and that the student is always going to be passing diagonal, because I want to encourage that bilateral communication from her. And the professor is always going to be passing to the outside. So the student passes crossing from the inside, professor passes from the outside. You have 5 balls and you take turns. So the student passes diagonal, professor passes on the outside. And what this allows the student to do is they can make mistakes now, because I'm able to grab those balls and throw them back to her at the right tempo and in the right location. So it creates a larger margin of error for the student to have, while still managing a rate of 2.5 balls, a 2.5 out of 3, right? So I like to say that this is the closest we can take someone to juggling without juggling for them. And if the person's not able to process this pattern in the air, you can always do it with them on the ground, and then try to work up to throwing as you develop. The last strategy I have for you, the last suggestion, is to do restricted feedback systems. So it's very common that when a person has figured out how to juggle, but they'll tell you, oh, I can only juggle when I'm walking or when I'm running, because every throw they're making is in front of their body. This is usually because the person is using their shoulder more than they're using their elbow. So we need to encourage them to use their elbow more than their shoulder, so that they can stand in one place and juggle at the same time. The thing is, if you tell someone this, if you say, hey, use your elbow more, and then they go to juggle again, they're not going to use their elbow more, because the dominant muscle group is closer to the signal. And when we're under stress, when we need to move rapidly, you know, it's quite common for the signal to go to the dominant muscle group first, or to the last muscle group. So you tend to see shoulder movement or wrist flicking, right? Getting the signal to go directly to the elbow requires a lot more like intention. And I think it's really hard to get someone to understand that idea just using words. So the concept here is, by using a stretchy band and connecting the elbows behind the back, what that does is it creates a natural feedback for the person anyway. If they throw now and they reach up with their arm, or they try to move that arm forward, that motion is going to make a correction to the other side for them. So now, as they're doing the activity, they're going to get constant sensory feedback information and conditioning of the correct behavior, which is to use the elbows and not the shoulder. To summarize the key points of this lesson plan now, the emphasis throughout the lesson plan is on social and emotional learning outcomes. This goes back to this idea, like if someone wants to learn how to ride a bike, we have to provide physical safety for them first. And if someone wants to learn how to juggle, we have to provide emotional learning safety for them as well. And because juggling is perceived as this inaccessible activity, the act of learning to juggle often produces a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. And this creates another barrier for them to learn. Instruction through narrative-based intention as opposed to technical explanation. Whether or not you use the same storytelling techniques as me is not important, but storytelling is a really effective way to teach anything that is going to naturally be produce anxiety, right? And this is not a complicated way to teach. We use these methods of teaching so much predominantly in early childhood development. We're constantly using storytelling with infants to get them to understand how the world works, right? And we can do this with juggling too. And if we do it with juggling, we will find better learning results. Propose problem-solving environments opposed to direct solutions. So like an example of this is when the student is learning to do the cascade and they make that error of passing the ball between their hands. We don't want to explain to them what the solution is. What we want to do is try to create an environment in which they can discover that solution. So in this case, it means holding the ball with my hand. But in the situation, like with the juggle board, as we're going to learn later on, it's going to mean constantly adapting the frequency, not giving explanation, but giving opportunities for people to learn. This is the key element. We have to give our students the benefit of the doubt. And it's really important that we structure accomplishment into our lesson plan. So with that classical model of learning, there's only 3 outcomes, and 2 of them, and 2 of the outcomes isn't even really, there's steps along the way. They're not me reaching my goal. Whereas in the 5-step model, it's just constant outcome, constant sense of accomplishment. And this is all leading to the production of dopamine in the brain. It's causing a more positive sense of self. Any human being with a positive sense of self is going to overcome the challenges that are put in front of them. Whereas if you expose the student to just constant failure and then ask them to do something they've never done before, I don't know what you expect those outcomes to be. And then creative expression is part of learning, and it offers a personal relationship or language. So I think if you're not someone who's done this or considered this to be part of your early juggling material, your lesson planning, if you start to allow your students to express, you will be surprised at what they come up with. And I think you will also observe, like I have, a much different relationship with the activity. You know, they don't see the juggling as this technical thing. It's not about competition anymore. It becomes about what can I say with this thing, with this idea? How much can I communicate? What can I express? Or how much attention can I have? You know, because people like attention. It's a good thing for them. The review points. Actually, I need to use the bathroom real quick. Let me take a quick moment. I'll be right back. You can process that.
Ich nutze mal die Zeit, um einfach zwischendrin mal zu fragen, ob soweit für jeden okay ist und mitkommt, so, also auch wegen Englisch einfach, oder ob es Fragen an der Stelle gibt, die man vielleicht auf Deutsch einfacher erklären kann. So. Wenn nicht, dann machen wir einfach gleich weiter.
Okay, so right now is normally the class would be finishing in 15 minutes, right? But I started late, half hour late. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I went pretty fast with this material. And today was more observation. You guys are just getting this theory. You know, it's really about setting the stage for all the conversation we're going to be having. So it's if you didn't grasp everything, it's okay. It's going to repeat itself. There's a lot of repetition with these ideas because we're really focusing on what our solutions and our strategies are going to be. But just to do a review of the course now, and then if anyone is still here, I'm very open to having conversations and getting to meet some of you guys. So let me just finish up with this review. So the key points here is juggling cannot be defined by its action. It is a formula experience that distorts our sensory, and that is it is a formula experience that acts to distort our sensory relationship with time, which produces this unique state of mind that we recognize as global activation. So we started off by deconstructing this idea of juggling not being its action, saying that it relates to a particular state of mind. We know this state of mind. We have many words for this state of mind. We're trying to understand what this state of mind is. We don't know what it is, but we know that it's there and we see what it does. We also talked about how the impacts of juggling are universal because its real impacts, its real benefits are being produced by the state of mind that it creates, just like meditation and yoga. It's relative to the individual time a person spends engaged with its activity, with its state of mind. So this is what makes juggling more accessible than the transformation of its action alone. Like just being able to transform the action of juggling makes it super accessible. But understanding that it is the state of mind that juggling produces that's causing all this developmental growth in our brains, I think makes it incredibly universal. Juggling itself is not an accessible activity, but rather we make it inaccessible through our cultural misunderstandings and failed teaching practices. And I don't mean to be too hard with this idea. Like I'm not criticizing anyone. You know, I came up in the same industry. I've used the same methods, and I'm not sure why we didn't ask these questions before. I'm not blaming anyone for that, but I think it is really important that we recognize that we were wrong and that we start asking ourselves these questions now. And, you know, hopefully there'll be more methodologies, there'll be more ways of solving these problems in the future, and that this course is just the beginning for you guys. Linear scaffolding is not an effective means for teaching juggling because it lacks clear opportunity to experience its own sensation as part of the learning process. So I use the 3-step model, right? I use the 5-step juggling class or the example of the 3-ball tossing cascade, you know, to deconstruct this idea. But when we start to work with the juggle board more, like you really start to see how we're able to provide the experience and the sensation of juggling as part of its learning process. Doing it with traditional toss juggling is a little bit tricky. We have to be creative with like the body juggling and the table juggling. But when we start to work with tools like the juggle board, then we don't have to wait at all. You know, it's like training wheels. It's having training wheels on juggling. But the thing for you guys in terms of educational modeling, what to understand is that anytime the experience of an activity is not there as you're learning, then scaffolding isn't going to be your friend. Scaffolding only becomes our friend once the person is to experience. And I encourage you to also think about this idea and reflect upon it in other disciplines in circus as well, not just in juggling. You know, I gave you guys the example of the trapeze and the tight wire, but look around your classrooms and look at the amount of interest you have from your students. What are they drawn to? It's going to be the things that they're able to experience as they're learning. It's not going to be the things that have barriers. Emphasis of social and emotional learning strategies outweighs those of technical. So whether or not you believe me yet, I encourage you to try. You know, if you're not convinced, if you have your way of teaching juggling and you don't like the 5-step model, don't use it, but at least try it. At least try it a couple times and see if it makes a difference for you. And as you're trying it, be really aware, even if you don't try it, even if you're like, I want to use my model still, the emotional strategies, the thing like using narrative-based instruction is really transferable for whatever you're teaching. I think especially the more technical the thing is you want to explain, the better it is that you use narrative. Because the idea is you don't want to give more information than you have to, right? And people are capable of figuring things out. So we have to let our students do that. There is no confusion or doubt over the unique benefits juggling has to offer, but there are some concerns over its perceived levels of inaccessibility. Certainly any school system would be delighted to have their students benefit from the unique impacts of learning how to juggle. However, because it is not considered accessible for everyone, it fails to meet the criteria for universal implementation. And it is within our power to change this unnecessary reality going forward. So just to point out this reality that not only is juggling not accessible, but the world wants what juggling has to offer, right? Like these states of mind, these impacts, these benefits, there's no confusion or doubt about it. And even now with the way that society is changing and the needs of education going forward in the future, traditional learning models are not developing this innovative capacities. You know, the future workforce, the future society needs to have more imagination. They need to be more creative. And the developmental impacts of juggling provide that, just like the developmental impacts of playing a musical instrument or learning another language provide that type of growth. So school education is really looking for this material right now. We have a lot of work to do. We all have a lot of work to do because we have the solution in itself, but we have cultural transformation that needs to take place. We need society to understand that, oh, look, sorry, we got it wrong. The juggling is not as inaccessible as we presented it to be. It's actually much more accessible. We should have it in school systems. Every student can learn to juggle. When society understands that, then we will be everywhere. So the homework assignment, you know, these are optional things, right? It's always suggestions, is for you to find at least one person who does not know how to juggle and experiment teaching them using the 5-step model. I'll share the link now, and then maybe Mark can send it in an email if we need that as well. So the videos are there for you to review. Also, if you Google 5-step juggling, you'll find a lot of videos and demonstrations. I think there's actually a good one from a guy in Germany. I have to find that link. It's in German. I will find it for you guys. So if you have the time, try this out because I want to hear your reflections. And then next week I will be early. Normally I tend to arrive at least 10 to 15 minutes early so that anyone who comes early and they want to have discussions or reflections about that, because there's not time built into the class for that, for the homework assignments, but anyone who does and shows up early, or you're always welcome to write a reflection and email it to me at quatprops@gmail.com or post it in the chat, you know. I'm always interested to hear about your experiences. I'm going to stop my screen share now. I managed to finish the class half an hour early, or not really, because really now is when we would open up for this conversation. And also at the beginning, we would have taken more time to get to know each other a little bit first, make an introduction. So maybe we can do a little bit of that now. Whew. Thank you for listening to me for so long. For being patient, thank you. If we have questions or topics, you guys want to have a discussion, I'm open. No? If not, I still got time, I'm going to use it. Because if you guys don't have questions, then we can play a game.
I'm pretty sure that because that was how I perceived my first workshop, it's a bit overwhelming at the beginning. So this is normal, like you get a lot of information and then someone, okay, where's the questions? And you are like, I have no idea. So I just want to take the opportunity to maybe provide some experience we have with using the method, like especially the 5-step stuff. So we use it like for 3-4 years now, just normally included in our whatever circus projects we do. So when we do juggling, we provide this. It's not like that we do like a step-by-step, but we just provide the material. And one experience I just want to share, it's like that we have kids that are like normally we used to work with groups that are like they have not a lot of attention span, so it's especially hard to do the juggling part. And we started using the stuff with the ring and the balls and introducing like certain kind of stories. And one interesting thing that happens really often is that they start to get really focused on the stuff with the ring and the ball. Like the first things are easy, and when you come to the stuff with the barn, where you open and close the door, that's really a tricky movement at the beginning. They really start to focus, and I never experienced this before with like normal methods. There was always way more work involved to like get them stay at the task, and here it was like they wanted to do it. So this was really amazing for me, and we worked a lot with migrants also. It was way easier to get to them. We didn't need to use so much technical language, so it was way easier to just communicate through either very simple ways of describing story, whatever, or sometimes just like mirroring or using no words at all. And it's way easier to do than with the normal method. So just experience I wanted to share. So yeah.
Does anyone else have any experience using this method already? I forget that it's already out there, you know?
Not like the whole 5 steps, so you filled in some gaps for me. I'm really happy about that. But like all the storytelling part and the part with the 3 balls on the body and the try out, like that would be one step before everything else you now teach for me. Having the stuff in the room and just saying, what do you usually do with that? Or like just try out doing a play with an object you later want to introduce as a juggling object or as a tool for movement and flow. But yeah, I'm very glad to have the barn thing. I tried it out for myself just right now, and it was like not that easy. And what Mark just said, sometimes if you have the focus about with a story for anything, not just circus or like movement teaching, but teaching in itself with a story makes people focus and like that thing. Like that's my experience for the biggest part of my work, to get them with a story, and then they start to now I'm missing a word. They start to identify themselves with the issue. That's the most important step, I guess.
Yeah. I think it seems a little bit strange that we would use this approach with juggling because juggling's so technical, right? But that's how it works, you know. I didn't make that up. It just tried out both models, and one produces better results than the other. So that's what I do. I'm curious to know about you guys though. It looks like a diverse group. Everyone here works in social circus or some form of education with circus. Is there anyone that doesn't work in circus? What do you people do? You're the interesting
Kann das gerade jemand übersetzen? Ich habe nicht verstanden, was gefragt hat.
Ob hier alle in sozialen Zirkusprojekten so arbeiten oder jemand nicht in Zirkus unterrichtet oder in Zirkusprojekten arbeitet.
Translation?
Yes.
Was that in English?
Yeah.
That was in English?
Yeah, there's a problem with social circles because I don't speak very much English, but social circus is not the translation for us because it's Zirkuspädagogik and it isn't sozialer Zirkus. There's a difference, and there's many people discuss with the words. But in my opinion, it is Zirkuspädagogik and it isn't sozialer Zirkus. So I am always a trainer, yes.
Okay, so you're teaching circus. You have a different terminology for it.
Kann das vielleicht jemand übersetzen?
Also die Frage ist, du arbeitest sozusagen oder unterrichtest im Kontext von Zirkus. Du hast halt nur eine andere Terminologie, das auszudrücken. Ich finde es tatsächlich ganz spannend, weil ich habe diese Unterscheidung selber nie gemacht zwischen sozialen Zirkus und Zirkuspädagogik. Ich meine, das eine ist ein Oberbegriff vielleicht und das andere eine Ausrichtung oder so, aber insoweit finde ich das tatsächlich spannend, das mal aufgemacht zu sehen, so das Thema. Aber genau, das war die Frage. So for you, yes, Greg, it was about she's teaching in circus. We have terminology. It's like circus pedagogy. This is like the way we describe it in Germany. It's like teaching things, circus things, and social circus is like a concept mainly used here from Cirque du Soleil or Cirque du Monde, and it's like focusing on a specific part, but I think a lot of people differ between those two terms.
Yeah. No, I understand that. I mean, the traditional meaning of social circus is the use of circus as a form of social intervention for at-risk or marginalized youth. And so it's very specific, but I don't use it this way. For me, anytime you're using circus, like functional juggling, anytime you're using juggling for something else, it's functional juggling. Anytime you're using circus to make an impact on the world, it's social for me. And then whatever tool you use with inside of that model, that's how I see social circus. But I have a very broad understanding of this word.
But just because I'm interested too. So Tabea and Petra was basically like raising the hand and saying, no, I'm not working in circus. So I just want to ask that again, so it's not hidden.
So are we all working in circus then? Is that the conclusion? No. Who's not working in circus? I want to hear what these people are doing.
I'm not working in the circus. I'm a social worker actually, and I started being in circus and doing circusy stuff like 2 years ago. And I'm a person, I'm very shy, and when it comes to new stuff, it always feels awkward to me. And luckily I got a lot of people who were super sensitive and were like trying the 5-step method with me, and it took a lot of pressure away, which I really enjoyed. And actually at the moment I'm working on a project with a client, and she has a disability, so she can't use her hands right, or she sees 2 pictures. She got this ataraxia, so she sees 2 pictures at the same time, so it's very difficult to throw a ball and catch it because she doesn't know where's the ball. And so we tried a lot of stuff from the first step of the 5-step method, and we tried a lot of body contact, and then she automatically started talking in pictures. So visualizing is super helpful, and yeah, she got a very fast progress, and I'm super impressed. And yeah, I'm pretty curious how it's going on in this course, and I got already the board, and my client is super happy, and yeah. just have a look how it goes.
I have a question directly concerning to Tabea. Will you come to how to work with people with disabilities the next days? Or is it possible to use the 5-step method for every disabilities? Or do you think that there are disabilities you try with where it worked good or not good? So,
Actually, I'm already started working with her, and
I was asking Craig, but we can also answer. Sorry.
I'm sure, Tabea, if you already started working, then you would agree with me that, yeah, it's accessible, because we can always adapt it too. It doesn't have to be a throw, right? Like, we're still introducing this idea of like focusing on seeing more the relationships between things and not the actions, not to look at everything so literally. Because if the person's not good at throwing and catching, then I make them work with a scarf, or instead of throwing the ball, we roll the ball underneath on a track. So if I have a juggle board track, I can be rolling the ball back and forth on the track and passing the ring. We're going to get more into this next week, I think, about the sensory relationship, like what we need. We just have to interact with objects that are in motion. It's not important how they're in motion. So anytime it's not accessible physically for someone, we can always adapt those elements. But I mean, if I'm working with someone who's like severely disabled, like they're just not like, they have to have communication, right? There's a lot of like basic communication that's going on, not necessarily verbal, but like they have to have awareness of others. If anytime it doesn't work, the 5-step method, I have the juggle board. So, Mark, what's up?
I just wanted to address this because this is also like experience we did. The most tricky person, it's strange to call it like this, but the most tricky thing we did where I actually experienced what's possible was working in a center for disabilities. And there was one person who was, I just say it in English for Greg, I think it's called multiple severely disabled. In German, it's mehrfach schwerbehindert. And they was mentally and physically disabled, and he was barely possible to maybe grab a ball and throw it anywhere, but not like direct movement or stuff. It was not possible for him to use the juggle board. We tried, but we failed because he was not able to really respond to it. So we tried, we will see this later, that the ideas are adaptable to different things. We used a thing like, I think it's called the domino board or something. It's like clapping cards, but we can I think if we don't focus on the course, we can just share stuff about this. So, but it was possible to work with him, and you just had to adapt. So this is something that was like the most difficult stuff I did, where I was like challenged, and everyone around me, every teacher was saying, no, this is not possible at all. And we managed to do quite well, actually. But yeah, just as an experience, because I think the question was about if it's possible with several or different types of disabilities to work with. So yes, it's definitely possible. Just one thing. I think Petra, or no, who was it? I think another one was also saying like he's not working in, yeah, Petra. So.
Yeah, hello. I'm actually a psychologist, and juggling was only a hobby for me, and I tried for a couple of years to start with some people. They have a very low self-esteem, to just learn something what they thought they can never do, and that was nice to see that they actually just after 1-2 hours they can do it, and that this was also really emotional for me too, to see the development. And then I made a school together with Carl, the, how is it in English, process oriented juggling, something like that, where you really teach the people how to juggle from step by step, and what is going on in your body and your emotion. And this was really interesting. And now I just wanted to, yeah, make groups and be creative with juggling and making more than a hobby out of it. Yes.
And you're a psychologist. How do you practice? Like are you?
I'm in a prison.
Ah.
Yeah.
And you're given therapy sessions there?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. There's so much potential for provoking emotion, and then creating for provoking negative emotion, and then using juggling as a way to positively restore that emotion, right? We're gonna be looking at that, especially with the juggle board, because it's so tactile. You get this real strong sense. So I think you're gonna have a good time. You're gonna have a really good time. Thanks for being here. If anyone else wants to make an introduction with me now too, I'm open. It's just nice to meet you guys. I'd like to know who I'm, because I'm sitting here in a room by myself. It's nice to know. Who's this guy? Everyone speaks English, yes? Everyone speaks English? Where are we based? Where are we based?
I don't really speak English because I speak fluently French. So when I want to talk in English, first French comes. So it's really complicated to know, not French, English now. So I didn't understand all what you say, but I will read it, and I will take my time to understand, and so I will see. I try to follow, and yes, I have some experience, like what you called shadow juggling. We invented 20 years ago, and I worked a lot with it, and with stories also, because I played improv theater for a long time, so I make a mixture of all. And today, so you asked if we are working in circus. I don't know the English word. I am Bildungsreferentin, also ich bin geschäftsführende Bildungsreferentin Zirkuspädagogik für das Land Nordrhein-Westfalen. Und seitdem ich das bin, gebe ich herzlich wenig nur noch praktische Unterrichtsstunden. Aber vielleicht kann das jemand übersetzen.
I don't know the exact word, but she's not teaching very much because she's for all circus pedagogy. So we discussed the word. She's for the education in Germany, so that there is a point where she works who have the references of all circus points in Germany and looking for education and develop them there.
Where are we based here in this group? Are we concentrated around any cities? Which cities is everyone? Or we're spread out all over Germany?
It's actually spread out. So, and we are not only Germany, so we have 2 visitors from Austria also. So really glad about that. So
I gave a seminar in Austria once. I was there. I don't remember the name of the school. I think I gave 2 seminars in Austria. There's a circus training program there for teachers. No, nobody knows it. Okay, maybe I dreamt it. In France, cool. So I think if the idea is not like to take away any sort of like real solid knowledge, except for like the lesson plan, like that's where you guys can take away information today and that lesson plan modeling. But all the other stuff, like if you're confused about, you should be. Like the point is to be sort of like bring us to a place for the next class where we're not sure what juggling is anymore. Like just to be open to the ideas that are going to come next. So yeah, if anyone felt overwhelmed, like that probably feeling is going to keep happening, but in the end, it's all going to work out. I promise. A lot of people have survived this course.
There's one point that might be interesting. It's not a solution for now, but it might be a solution for later. So especially for people like Uschi who have issues with understanding everything or just issues with the language. So beside that, in the future, we want to have those kind of seminars in German also. Beside this, we are trying to work on a digital platform for Europe, and because this involves all the countries and every country is talking in their own language, we will also have like a German discussion group there. So it's basically like a forum or something like this, but there will be opportunities later. I can't really say when, but most likely during the next year. We are still in development there. But there will be opportunities to like not only attend seminars and have the opportunity there, but to connect with people in an easier way. I'm really, it's unfortunate. I would have really liked that we already have it right now, because I really like the idea of having like a forum or discussion group accompanying such a webinar. But okay, we have to work with what we have right now, and we don't have it right now, but yeah, this is definitely happening. But beside this, if anyone is curious and have issues understanding just because of the language mainly, yeah, just either message me or send me an email and we can try to help you along the way, that's for sure.
Jetzt musst du es aber noch mal auf Deutsch sagen.
Das ist richtig. Das ist natürlich, ja, super. Also genau, nur noch mal kurz zusammengefasst. Also wir sind gerade oder wir sind seit einiger Zeit dabei, europäisches Netzwerk aufzubauen und sind jetzt aber in einer Phase, wo wir halt, wo das deutlich stärker vorangeht, und Teil dieses Netzwerkes oder Teil dessen, was da passiert, ist, dass wir auch eine Plattform haben werden, um all diese Länder zu vernetzen, und da wird es sicherlich auch einfach Möglichkeiten geben, in der Landessprache entsprechend sich auszutauschen. Das gibt es jetzt im Moment noch nicht. Wir sind aber ziemlich zuversichtlich, dass wir es im Laufe des nächsten Jahres schaffen werden, so weit zu kommen. Und unabhängig davon, dass es diese Möglichkeit zukünftig geben wird, sich da einfacher, also man kann ja auch so einfach Leute anfragen oder so, das ist ja kein Thema, aber dass es da einfacher werden wird, da einfach in Diskussionsgruppen oder Foren in so einer Form sich auszutauschen, ist generell auch nochmal, wenn es jetzt zwischendrin Schwierigkeiten einfach im Verständnis gibt. Ich kann nicht simultan übersetzen oder so. Ich habe selber nicht so das Problem mit Englisch im Verstehen und im Sprechen, aber ich könnte nie im Leben simultan übersetzen. Das überlastet mein Gehirn. So. Aber wir können gerne, wenn du Schwierigkeiten im Verständnis wegen der Sprache hast, dann schreib einfach mich an per E-Mail und dann können wir schauen, dass wir dir auf jeden Fall da durchhelfen. So, das auf jeden Fall, genau.
I just shared a link in the chat for this presentation. So it's a PDF, and then it has video links to YouTube for the videos. If anyone wants to review that.
We will also we will send out an email after once the recording is uploaded. I will send an email with the recording, with the presentation stuff and all the material like the homework and stuff. So in case anyone is like missing it now or so, you will definitely get the information in the next days.
And then for next week too, I think you need to have read up to chapter 9. You should have read up to chapter 9. I know I asked that everyone read the book beforehand, but I know this doesn't always happen, so you can kind of go along. Has anyone finished the book? Nobody finished the book yet, just Mark. Okay, so this course is really going to mean, it's really going to make a difference. I think if you read the book and you're taking this course, it's going to make a big difference for you. It's because otherwise you're going to go back to read the book and then you're not going to have me here to ask questions too, right? So if you can read it now, and then you have this opportunity to talk about it with me, that's going to be the best outcome for you. So if you can, by next week, read up to chapter, I think the end of chapter 9 is where you need to be.
That's 7 for today, no?
7, it was 7 for today. Yeah, so only 2 chapters. I think it's a long chapter though.
That's really nice reading it and then getting a better understanding when you tell it again. Yeah, that helped, especially because it's not like profane English. It's like, yeah.
Cool.
And I can definitely tell I struggled a lot while translating. I wasn't not translating the book, so I'm definitely not doing this. Maybe in the future we get someone we can pay for, but not doing it myself. But I was translating basically stuff like the information we had about the workshop, and it's really I struggled a lot because there's like specialized words, and it's not about the words themselves, but it's about you can't translate one-to-one. You have to basically get the meaning and then really search for a way to express it in German. And a translator, like a translating tool, not really always helps there. So I can certainly understand if there's like a struggling with the content of the book. Because that's really a language barrier right now.
So I have one question to Mark about the translation. What's the difference between expression and experience? How would you say it in German?
It's always, as far as I understood. Es ist Erfahrung und Ausdruck. So, also du kannst etwas ausdrücken. Das ist like expression. So. Und Experience ist am ehesten übersetzt mit Erfahrung. Das auf die Gefahr hin, dass ich an der Stelle tatsächlich auch nicht hundertprozentig das Richtige erzähle. Vielleicht zwischendrin auch. Also ich merke das tatsächlich. Ich habe jetzt mittlerweile 3 oder 4 Workshops, die eigentlich immer wieder das Gleiche sagen, mitgemacht. Und es ist immer noch so, dass ich neue Facetten merke oder neues Verständnis entwickle. Das muss man tatsächlich dazu sagen. Ich war nach dem ersten, dachte ich so, ich weiß, worum es geht. Und nach dem dritten habe ich festgestellt, ich weiß immer noch nicht, worum es geht. Nur das nochmal als, ja, auch als Hintergrund so ein bisschen. Aber das eine ist halt, dass ich eine Erfahrung vermitteln kann, zum Beispiel die Erfahrung, eine Kaskade zu machen. Und das ist unabhängig davon, wie ich das tue. Ob die auf dem Boden ist, ob die in der Luft ist, ob ich die mit Fahrrädern mache, es ist vollkommen irrelevant. Es ist diese Erfahrung, dieses rechts, links, über Kreuz, ist etwas Bilaterales, was im Gehirn passiert. Das ist Expression-based. So. Und das ist Experience-based. So, das ist die Erfahrung, die ich mache. Und Expression ist halt, wenn ich sage, das ist ein Keulenjongleur, dann sehe ich etwas ganz Spezifisches und es ist dieser Ausdruck, um den es geht. So. Oder ich sage, der jongliert mit, weiß ich nicht, Kettensägen oder der schwimmt. Oder das ist ein blödes Beispiel, ist vielleicht ein blödes Beispiel, aber es ist sozusagen, da geht es mehr um diesen ganz spezifischen, wie sich das nach außen äußert. Und das andere ist, wie meine innere Erfahrung ist. So. It was about the difference between expression and experience, and yeah, it's sometimes hard to really. It's not easy to just put the words in the translator, and oh yeah, I know what he means, because sometimes it took a lot of time. And
no, I'm just enjoying watching you do my job for me. I'm just happy about that. Happy that you're taking on that responsibility. Cool. So, anything else?
I could imagine it's a good time to actually finish and let people just like sink in the stuff and think about it. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of stuff, and it was like 3 hours now nearly, so I guess it's a quite good time now to just say, hey, we see us tomorrow anyway. So any questions left?
Oh, you guys tomorrow. Oh, okay. I have to remember that, because normally each class has like a week between. So like with these homework assignments, it makes more sense. But you guys might not have a chance to do it, you know. But obviously at some moment you're going to apply all the things you learned from this class, right? So anytime you can apply what you learned from the class and have time to reflect on it, it's great. But maybe, okay, I'm going to see you guys tomorrow. Wow.
Sorry,
it's good that we talk about
until tomorrow.
Sorry? What's that?
So we have to read until chapter 9 till tomorrow.
It's going to make it easier. It's going to make it easier for you. Okay. It will make this material easier for you. If not, I'm going to explain it again anyway. But having it already been in your head, it's not going to seem so weird.
Okay, just get sure. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's also quite good to emphasize. It's good if you have the time. It makes it easier for you if you can do like the homework, can read the stuff, but it's entirely not needed. So you can just follow along. You have basically like at least 2 months, or if you download the video later, you have your entire life to just watch it again and just take your time with it. So there's no pressure on yourself. So.
Yeah, because ultimately too, the reason we approach this way of learning as well is because no one is going to apply functional juggling in the same way. Like none of you are going to apply this in the same way. So we try to leave it open for you to, you know, take what matters for your work and use those tools, not to be so prescriptive with everything. Cool. All right, I'm gonna see you guys tomorrow. Nice to meet everyone.
So yeah, thanks, Craig. So I'm really happy we worked out everything. So I will just let's just for my own safety, for my emotional safety, let's just say I give you a message tomorrow 1 hour before, so I'm emotional safe myself. So then we know everything is happy and I'm not stressed out. So, but yeah, thanks everyone and thanks, Craig. So really looking forward to tomorrow. So.
Cheers. See you guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thanks.